Hey everyone, Coach Powers here, and I want to talk to you today about something that I think is extremely important to anyone going through benzo withdrawal and recovery. No matter where you are in your taper, whether you're just beginning, whether you're deep in the middle of withdrawal, or maybe you're 2 or 3 years out and you're still struggling to heal, you still find yourself in what seems like acute protracted withdrawal. Stay tuned. This video is going to be very, very helpful. Believe me, it might even change your life. I mean, it's that important. So I want to say something first about rumination. At first glance, it seems like just another kind of harmless, byproduct of benzo withdrawal, something that we don't have much control over, that really doesn't cause maybe that much trouble for us. I'm here to tell you it's not. It's not just simply another benzo withdrawal symptom like tinnitus or upset stomach. Quite literally, rumination becomes its own disorder. Obsessive rumination becomes its own disorder. And we need to have some understanding about what it is, why it happens, and how we can treat it. So I want to start at the beginning, with the definition. What is rumination? Because it's kind of confusing for us. So simply put, rumination is defined as repetitive negative thoughts fixated on problems, symptoms, or situations, particularly those out of our control or that which cannot be answered. Now think about that. I mean, that pretty much beautifully defines our predicament, right? Situations, particularly those out of our control, and, looking for answers that don't exist. Hence, why am I here? When will this end? Will this ever end? I mean, nobody can answer these questions directly for us, right? And it creates this sort of obsession within us. We're searching for the answers. We need the reassurance. So let's back up a minute and ask ourselves, why do we ruminate? First, why do we ruminate? Well, rumination is a normal process. I mean, that first needs to be understood. It's normal. People ruminate. If tomorrow I woke up and there was a eviction notice on my door, I'm going to ruminate. I'm going to, probably for the next 36 hours, right? I'm going to sit around, oh my God, how did this happen? Is there anything I can do about it? How much money do I need to get up? Can I reach out to the landlord? Is this legal? Should I reach out to the courts? Should I be looking for a new place to live? I mean, your mind would just circle over this problem. And, that's what rumination essentially is, initially anyway, right? It's just a cognitive process that's consumed with an intense problem. It's an intense problem-solving mechanism. Well, what's more, intense than benzo withdrawal, right? Of course, there's so many areas we're trying to understand in benzo withdrawal. What is this drug? What about the doctors? What about tapering? What about diet? What about sleep? What about all the symptoms? And the thing about rumination is it really is a learned habit, and if we back up, we look at what's worrying. Worrying is similar to rumination, but it's much less frequent, and it focuses on different things. The extremity is different. It kind of begins with just, worrying, and then it starts to drift into pure rumination. And rumination is just sort of the circling. The plane's just circling and circling over this problem. So the real problem is that, like I said, rumination is a habit. You learn this from somewhere, usually, and it's highly correlated that there's someone in our family who also ruminates, our mother, our sister, somebody we know is a constant worrier. So we kind of learn this stuff at home, typically. Maybe we've been a ruminator, or, we've had anxiety and we've worried most of our life, that might be hardwired in us. Maybe we had health anxiety. So the problem is, it becomes, it moves from being a habit that we learned to becoming a full-blown addiction. And this is more troubling because when we get on these forums, and pretty much anywhere you go to learn anything about benzos, where there's communication with other people, you're going to see rumination, right? I mean, you get on any forum or any comment section of any video on YouTube having to do with benzos, and you're going to see people and they're ruminating. And, why is this happening to me? When will this end? This is hell. And so we learn this, we see it, we say, oh, they're participating in this, and that resonates with us. We start to participate, and we get sucked into this vacuum of rumination with everyone. But we have to ask ourselves, why do we ruminate in the first place? What does it serve us? I mean, if it's just bad, why do we do it, right? It would be like just slapping yourself in the face. Well, we don't do that, so why do we ruminate? And simply put, rumination, in short, produces less emotion, less emotional and physical pain. It actually has a self-soothing mechanism. I mean, studies have shown that it lowers negative affect, just to a point, just a little bit. And so it's almost like biting your nails. I mean, you can get to a point where you're biting your nails, that your fingers are bleeding, they look ugly, they're getting infected even maybe, and you can't stop. And they hurt. They could even hurt. You're biting them till they hurt, but there's underneath the pain, there's still some kind of strange addictive self-soothing mechanism at play. So we need to look at rumination in a very similar light. That, like, yes, there is a little bit of self-soothing that goes on, but what I'm going to try to paint for you in the remainder of this video is all the negative, right? Because we get fixated on the quick, self-soothing mechanism of it, and I think once you're in there, then you're addicted to the rumination, and you don't see the big picture. You don't see how it's quite literally robbing you of good moments, that it's creating depression and anxiety and trauma and insomnia for you, and that it can quite literally keep you locked into benzo withdrawal. So, that said, yes, let's talk about that a little bit further, right? The relationship between depression, anxiety, trauma, insomnia. The studies have been very clear on this. Rumination oftentimes is a manifestation of those things. Oftentimes rumination comes from anxiety, it comes from depression, it comes from trauma, and it comes from insomnia. Now think about those four things and look at benzo withdrawal. I mean, those are the four horsemen of benzo withdrawal. You're anxious, you're depressed, you're experiencing complex trauma, sometimes for extended periods, years, and you're not sleeping. You develop insomnia, which is different than just having some sleep disturbances, right? Insomnia is its own little disorder. And I don't mean to say little, it's a big disorder. It's a big problem, and it creates a lot of, all these things create a flux of cortisol, epinephrine, serotonin. It really has a dynamic impact on our neurochemistry, all of these things. And rumination impacts all of them and can manifest from all of those. And further, and more importantly perhaps, rumination is often then manifests into those things, right? So you start off with you learning about your benzo situation. Oh my God, I've got to get off this med. This is crazy. My doctor's going to rip me off, or whatever the scenario is. You start ruminating. That rumination can then become depression. It can become anxiety. It can become trauma, and it can become insomnia. Now that's pretty damn important, right? I mean, that's the last thing we need, is to develop 1, 2, 3, or 4 other worse conditions while we're in our taper. So another important thing to remember about rumination, obsessive rumination particularly, is that it makes psych meds and therapy much less effective, sometimes not effective at all. I mean, rumination can quite literally override things like Ambien and Lunesta sleep aids. It can override your SSRI. It can override your benzo. And I don't care how great your therapist is, rumination can hijack that success too. So what happens here? The rumination activates the amygdala, which, of course, is the emotional center of the brain. It's the emotional processing center. And that center then sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which is the fight or flight center, which releases those nasty, neurotransmitters, cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine. So it's adrenaline and stress response, essentially, what we're looking at. And those two things, cortisol and adrenaline, are responsible for so much of your suffering. So much of your suffering. It creates a cascade, a ripple effect through the body of all kinds of physiological changes. And over time, this chronic stress, I mean, most people relate to some stress. People going through benzo, the stress is off the charts, and it just manifests into other things, health issues and health anxieties, and like I said, trouble sleeping, anxiety disorders, depression, and PTSD. So, we know the mechanism here, what rumination does, and it's quite vicious, because the more that it impacts the amygdala hypothalamus, the more the stress hormones are released, the more the reactivation in that frontal cortex and in that amygdala center. So the more we ruminate, in other words. So it's a match made in hell. It's a self-fueling loop of mental illness, and I've been talking about this for years. And I really believe that rumination is like the holy grail of why we don't heal in benzos. I mean, I really cannot say that loud enough and enough times. I mean, I'm hoping I'm going to paint a picture for you in this discussion, because again, rumination is often looked at like, it's just a byproduct of worrying. It's I just worry. It's like no, my friend. This is much greater than that. So let's look at two styles of rumination: brooding and reflection. Now, reflection is normally where it manifests. It goes from sort of a trigger, let's say a trigger, like whatever the trigger was. Oh my God, someone tells you that benzos are dangerous, you can't heal. You start ruminating. The rumination then moves to a point where what you're actually ruminating on are solutions. You're looking for answers. So you might look at websites about what is benzo withdrawal. What does it look like? What can I do about it? What are the different meds? What are the different therapies? How does diet impact it? Like all these little intricate things. You're studying it, you're researching, you're trying to solve the problem, right? Nothing too wrong yet. Now, what happens even in the reflection style of rumination is that eventually you solved you solved the Rubik's Cube, you solved the math formula. There's no new supplements. I mean, you could pretty much teach a course at some point on benzo withdrawal and recovery, right? But yet, what we do is we go back over and let's run the math one more time. Let's run the math again and again and again. And eventually what happens is it's not about solving the formula. It's about the act of solving the formula. It's not about the answer anymore. And that's where you get caught. That's where you end up on all these different supplements or different therapies, and you're spending all this time rehashing and trying to explore all these little avenues of the things you already know, that you already know in your heart. There's no more answers out there, but we want to believe it, and it's self-soothing to act, to engage in this process of rumination. So that's reflective. It's looking for answers. It's still asking ourselves how, which is important, productive response style of thinking. You have a flat tire, you ask yourself, okay, how did this happen? How did I get a flat tire? You might get out of the car, you investigate the tire. Okay, how do I get out of this? Do I have a jack in the car? Is there somebody I can call? I mean, you're problem solving at this point. You're trying to get answers. But imagine if after you did that, you continue to stand outside the car and you started looking at different styles of jacks that could jack up the car. You start looking at all different types of lug nuts and tire makes and models. And then you go down and you start reading about the history of making tires. I mean, at this point, you're just ruminating. Yeah, it's reflective. You're kind of trying to solve the problem, but it's not helping. You're standing out there for hours researching on the history of tire making. How is this going to help you change the tire? It doesn't, right? So the next style is brooding. And this is where most of us find ourselves. This is really the nastier part of the rumination. It goes from worrying, it turns into a reflective style rumination, and then that becomes brooding. And what brooding is basically asking ourselves incessantly questions that there are no answers to. It goes from how, like I said, response style of how, questioning, how do I get out of this? Now we're asking ourselves things like, why am I in this? Why is this happening to me? When will it end? Will I ever be normal after this? What if I'm not normal? What if my doctor retires? Oh my God, what if they rip me off the meds? What if this prolonged acute stress is causing a bunch of ailments underneath all this? What if I have a heart problem now? Benzos could change rhythm of hearts. You start thinking all this stuff, and at some point, again, with brooding, there's absolutely no positive impact. There's no problem solving. Asking yourself, when will this end, is not going to solve your problem. Now imagine again with the tire scenario with the car. Your car breaks down, you get out of the car, you just sit there and you look at the tire and go, why is this happening to me? This always happens to me. And what if I don't get this tire changed? What if I never get this tire changed? What if I just end up living on the side of the road? What if a car, oh my God, is my tail lights on? Is my hazard lights on? What if a car runs off the road and hits me while I'm standing here? What if I'm changing the tire and somehow the tire blows up on me? I mean, this is the thought process, right? And again, it's not going to help you fix the situation. It's going to make you super anxious, super freaked out. And what are those emotions of anxiety? What is the emotions of fear? Again, it's activating that amygdala response to that hypothalamus response of flooding the body with these chemicals, and you're off to the races. I mean, that's the fuel. Once that's introduced, that adrenaline and cortisol, you're hooked. You're like a drug addict. Now you're in it. Now we're going to stand on the side of the road and ask why questions, until somebody comes and alters our course. So now we talk about, now let's look at what are our treatment options for obsessive ruminations. And one of the most important things we need to do first is we need to disrupt the cues that trigger the habit of rumination. In other words, if getting on Benzo forums, if watching videos on it, if calling other people that are going through Benzos, all this Benzo-related content can be very helpful at times, and it can be very damaging at the same time, because it sort of just keeps reminding the brain that we're in trauma. It's flooding the brain with the problem, and again, we're not looking for solutions. And these triggers could then go on to completely rob us of our day. You could wake up and have a decent day, and then have a trigger. It could be anything. It could be, I got on the Benzo forum, I saw this lady popped on there, and she said she's 8 years out and she hasn't healed yet. Oh my God, what if that's me? And you're off to the races. The next 16 hours, you cannot think right. You're crying. You're having fights with your spouse. You're in the bed. You're glued to the groups. You're calling people. You're researching things. Suddenly you're researching, different supplements, and I mean, you go down these rabbit holes, essentially, right? So we have to remove the trigger. We have to be mindful and say, what is the trigger? Well, every time I get on, this particular forum, let's say, or I watch this one person's podcast, oh my God, it just spins me. But remember, I told you at the beginning, rumination is addictive. There's a self-soothing component to it. So even getting on something that is going to be a trigger, there's strangely a self-soothing mechanism to it. There's a powerful addictive mechanism to it. And so you're going to be drawn back. Even though you're going, oh my God, this is triggering me. You can't stop. You're going to keep coming back and keep reading these horrible things. And so we have to learn to change those triggers. We really need to treat it like an addiction in some sense, and withdraw and taper from the actual act of rumination, whatever that is. And if you don't pull yourself off whatever the triggers are, if you can't first at least identify them, and then there's exercises, self-monitoring logs, for example, that I use with my clients, that comes from CBT. It really comes from functional analysis, basically a scientific approach of self-observation, or looking at a problem and breaking it down, analyzing it. Then you can be conscious and aware of your triggers in the first place. And then we need to make some changes there, Now, some triggers will be unavoidable, Some of them will just be intrusive. You could just be sitting there on the couch having a good moment, watching a TV, and a commercial comes on about Benzos or some kind of meds, and oh my God, it's boom, intrusive thoughts come flooding in the front of your mind, and it's, suddenly all you can think about is, oh my God, what if I never heal? And that becomes a trigger. So then what happens? Then comes the response style. We're not sitting there asking ourselves, how do we get out of this? In fact, we may not even want to run that. Maybe we already know. We got our taper plan. We got our recovery plan. We got our therapist. Everything's in a line. We don't want to think about this. Well, this trigger's now causing, triggering that rumination. So we're going to do that. So there's two ways to attack this. We approach it from the trigger and try to reduce the triggers, or at least our engagement with triggers. And then we have to change our response style. Meaning, once you've been triggered, once you find yourself starting to get pulled into the loop of rumination, what are we going to do about it? Right? So, I want to give you another kind of analogy. Imagine you come home from a war. You've seen great trauma. People, just horrible things. You were there way too long, seen too much trauma. And you come home, and really what you need is to rewire your traumatized brain, and really just absorb yourself in peace and tranquility and goodness and love and reassurance and compassion. And, you need lots of sunlight and beautiful nature and art and activities and nice music and nice movies and comedies. And you just really need to try to lull down that traumatized part of your brain and let the brain know again, hey, look, I'm not in the war zone. We're done with war. We're safe now. We're completely safe, right? And this could take a lot of time because your brain is hardwired. It's very untrusting, and for a good reason. It's trying to save your life. It says, whoa. You might think you're safe, but you were just in a war zone, man. I'm going to keep you alive. I'm going to keep hypervigilant for a while. And so we have to kind of, through repetition and it just takes, time, retrain the brain that we're not in a war zone anymore. But imagine when you come home, you don't do all those positive things that I just mentioned. Instead, you get on forums, with other war buddies, and you're looking at pictures about war, and you're reading articles on war, and you're watching war-related films, and you're listening to war-related podcasts about soldiers that had their friends killed in front of them, and soldiers that had their legs blown up, and soldiers that went crazy and ended up on meds and in hospitals, and and it's just, you go down this rabbit hole, and you ruminate, and all you do, your whole world is about war. Now I ask you, how is that traumatized part of your brain supposed to rewire itself? How's that part of the brain supposed to ever realize it's not still on the battlefield, right? Everything we're doing is counterproductive to it, yet it's self-soothing. We think we're solving a problem, but we're not. Our whole problem-solving mechanism has been completely hijacked. And I'm going to get into that more in a minute, because that's another very important thing to remember about this rumination. Not just that it's habitual, not just that it's addictive, not just that there's two different two different styles, brooding and reflective, and all these things. Rumination hijacks our response style, our thinking style. We go from problem solving to problem creating. We go from how thinking processes, how do we get out of this, to why thinking processes. It quite literally pulls us into a tunnel vision. So you're not as clever or aware as we might feel during rumination. No, we're very obsessive. I mean, we're almost like a dog with a bone. Don't try to take that bone from the dog. You might get bit. And remember, rumination feeds off the unknown. The less control we have, the more wild it becomes. I mean, that is really at the core nature of it. A question like, how do I taper, is nowhere near as interesting as, what if the taper doesn't work? You know what I mean? What if the taper doesn't work? What if I'm going too fast? What if I go too slow? What if the med stops working? What if I build up tolerance suddenly? I mean, these are juicy questions, and we can't answer that. We can't know that. What if you walk outside and a tree falls on you? But it's probable. So the brain goes, this is juicy. So we have, we have this mechanism that's addictive, that craves control, that craves answers to questions there are no answers for. So you might be asking yourself, what is treatment then? How do we treat this, Dave? And treatment begins with self-awareness and psychoeducation. And that's what I'm doing right now with you, I'm trying to give you some psychoeducation. I'm trying to bring us up to speed of what rumination is, why it exists, what it correlates with, different styles of rumination, all this stuff. I mean, it really starts with just an awareness of it. And then we need to become self-aware. We need to become aware of ourselves, not just of the mechanism of rumination, but what about our ruminations? What are our triggers? How much do we ruminate? How long do we ruminate? What are the consequences of our rumination? And how do we stop rumination? When have we maybe been successful in stopping rumination? Or when have there been periods where we were ruminating and it ended? Of course it ends. And what ended it? Again, going back to that functional analysis, breaking down this situation. And so there's logs, and I use logs that are based in what they call rumination-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and I've monitored my logs a little bit to be more benzo-friendly, benzo-oriented. So we use logs. There's mindfulness approach, and there's compassion work too. There's actually a compassion approach to changing our response styles. Now, I want to talk more about response style and really drive this home for you. You may or may not be familiar with something called binocular rivalry. Right, and to put it in simple terms, the eye, when you if you have, let's say, a set of binoculars, you have, and you put these binoculars on, and each eye focuses on an image, but they're different images. Now, the eyes look at two images and they combine two images. Both eyes see an image and they overlap the image. Well, the brain, when it's approached with two different images, can only focus on one. So it'll jump between one or the other typically. Now, in a depressed, anxious, traumatized brain, it overwhelmingly, if you show it an image that's positive and one that's negative, one that's good, one that's fearful, it's going to gravitate automatically and lock in on the negative, fearful thoughts. Negative, fearful image. That will then trigger negative thoughts. And so that's a really interesting phenomenon. And there's a lot of research that suggests a relationship between GABA and neuroplasticity, and they're doing a lot of research with binocular rivalry in terms of neuroplasticity. It's really an interesting area of study right now. But CBT actually uses some of binocular rivalry to actually test the effectiveness of CBT. And what they found is, people who underwent CBT, let's say for rumination, and they were effective, when they returned to the binocular rivalry test, their minds suddenly are focusing automatically on the positive image. That's the image that they favored, not the negative image. So that's really interesting if you think about it, that your mind, when you're going through rumination, you're not seeing things clearly. Like whenever there's an ambiguous information, whenever there's a missing piece of information, whenever you're at a crossroad and you need to look at something and you could go, what if I never heal, or I can't, what am I going to do once I'm healed? Like those are two options, equally important, equally valid options there. What if I never heal, and what am I going to do when I heal? We're going to gravitate toward the worst every time, right? And you think you're being a realist. You might even say that, I'm just being a realist. It's like, no, you're being puppeted. You're being a puppet of your unconscious mind. This process of depression, anxiety is going to steer the ship more than you believe, more than you may believe. So that's pretty damn important, right? That's pretty damn important if you're trying to change something and the whole time you're working at it, you're being manipulated and you don't even know it. So, yeah, binocular rivalry. I mean, it's really fascinating. CBT mindfulness, like I said, can result in more neuroplasticity and GABA production and utilization. So again, my approach with rumination is rumination-focused CBT / mindfulness. I combine both of those things and some compassion work. And there's other things, there's other activities, but it all starts there. So I want to say one last thing, guys. I really believe rumination is like the holy grail to this stuff. I mean, to prolong benzo suffering. So much of what we think is benzo withdrawal is really the manifestations and symptoms of these four horsemen that I mentioned earlier. It's anxiety. It's in whatever form. Could be health anxiety, could be panic disorder, could be agoraphobia, OCD thoughts, depression, major depression. Depression hurts. It causes all kinds of body ailments. It changes your thinking, DP, DR, akathisia, all this stuff. Trauma, the trauma response, the PTSD response. Look at those symptoms. And look at insomnia and look at what that does. You combine those four things with anyone coming off benzos, and I promise you, those four are more powerful and more damaging than just the sheer chemical withdrawal part of benzos. Especially if you're going on a microdose and you're going really slow. Those flux of those tapers, when compared to these four horsemen, is usually much less damaging, much less suffer, creating than major depression, insomnia, anxiety, trauma. So I've seen people, years removed from benzos, and they still think they're in acute withdrawal. And this is almost a topic of debate, I think, at some point here. Where does withdrawal end, and where does withdrawal continue because of all of these other symptoms? So when you're 3 years out and you're going, I still feel like I'm in acute. Well, it makes complete sense, because when you were in acute, you were dealing with profound insomnia, profound depression, profound anxiety disorders, and profound trauma. Well, here you are 3 years out, and what are you dealing with? Rumination has manifested these things, kept them going, made you resistant to meds, made you resistant to your taper, made you resistant to your SSRIs, and made you resistant to all the psychological therapeutic interventions you've tried. And so you're sitting in the stew still, and it's not going away, and it won't go away until we do something about the rumination. Now, some people, once they start to heal, they get a little momentum, they get back in their life, and it sort of happens on a natural, organic level. They sort of reverse engineer what led them to rumination is sort of reverse engineered, right? But again, it's an addiction, and it's not that simple. So you take like an alcoholic who's, obviously an addict to alcohol, and you say, okay, why did you start drinking? Oh, I had this trauma in my childhood. Okay, we could sit there in therapy. We can go over all that trauma and work through it and process it, and he can heal from that actual trauma. But guess what? Does that mean he's just going to stop drinking? No. He's an addict. He's addicted to alcohol. Doesn't matter what started it. It's helpful. It may be, going back and working on that trauma is much more correlated with him not sliding back into alcohol later because of those unconscious, mental processes or hang-ups related to the trauma that he endured as a child. So that part's good, right? We've heard the kind of the beginning of it, but now he's still an addict. And no amount of talk therapy is just going to make someone wake up and not crave alcohol. And no amount of me talking about rumination is just going to result in you waking up tomorrow and rumination is gone. But it may convince you, it can educate you, and you can understand the enemy, so to speak, and you can start to do real changes that are going to bring an end to this rumination, to break that addictive magnetism, if you will. So there are some thoughts on rumination. Guys, again, I can't say it enough. It really is the holy grail of suffering in a sense. It's the 4 horsemen of the suffering. It keeps us locked in it. It creates new suffering. And quite literally, if you don't get the rumination under control, you could very well be locked into suffering for years to come. On the other hand, I can say this with no doubt, if you get this rumination under control, if you can get on top of it, watch your symptoms, watch your recovery speed up, watch the symptoms decrease, watch your quality of life go up, and watch everything become so much more possible, and your recovery becomes so much more possible, guys. So yeah, rumination, it's pretty damn important, guys. It's pretty damn important. If you're interested in getting to work on your rumination, you can reach out to me at www.powersbenzocoaching.com, and we can kick its butt. All right, guys, I will talk to you soon. I got a new video coming out soon on Lake of Fire update, the Benzo recovery film that I'm shooting. New podcast coming. It's been a busy, busy summer so far. Hope you guys are fighting the good fight and doing well. Don't lose hope. Much love, guys. Talk to you soon. I don't wanna let myself down myself.